This is the Paul McGUIRE Report. I'm Paul McGUIRE. Welcome to all of you all over the world, all over the USA, and in every region, which is basically everywhere because of the internet. Welcome to the Paul McGUIRE Report. The difference between this program and most programs, either on AM, FM, or podcasting, or the whole spectrum of new technologies involving the internet and social media. The difference between this program and other programs I've done in the past, and that would include, doing 10 years of intensive regular appearances on the biggest shows on the Fox News Network and CNN and numerous secular media. And a lot of that media had a conservative perspective. I mean, they were the biggest shows on cable news, but they had a conservative perspective. And that's good because the majority of the media has a liberal bias. And you have to balance that out. You can't have, 100% liberal bias and no conservative point of view. That's like madness. That's what they have in totalitarian nations. But there has always been hidden forms of censorship. Now, when I say that, the first thing that comes to my mind is hidden forms of censorship in Christian or religious media also. So, for example, if you try to depart from the way things are normally done, the operative word is normally. I'm not interested in being normal. Never have been, never will be. Now, of course, conversely, I'm not interested in being abnormal either. But I just want to be whoever God created me to be. And of course, that involves growth and everything else. But my goal in life, and I certainly hope your goal in life, is not to fit into the tiny box. And that box, by the way, as you've probably noticed in the last couple of years, that tiny box of what they call normal keeps shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. And soon, that box that they call normal, or very cleverly using propaganda terms, they use the word new normal. New normal is a mind control term. If that's too intense for you, let's just call it by another name. The new normal is a social engineering term. It's a propaganda term. And the way it works is really simple. It plays to the pervasive, deep-seated insecurity that just about everybody has to one degree or another. Now, I have a habit of studying things that other people don't study. I mean, it's not something deliberate. It's just that I have a hunger for truth. I want to pursue the truth. This is something that began when I was raised in an atheistic household in New York City. I wanted answers. And I was told by my parents that, basically there was no God. And if there was a God, it certainly wouldn't have been the God of Christianity. And I was indoctrinated. Atheism is a religion, just like Christianity or Buddhism or those things are religions. So I was taught to believe that Christianity was a very bad thing. But that left a void, a hunger in my heart. So that caused me at a very, very young age to pursue very aggressively the truth. And that meant going after the answers, looking for the answers. And that's why one of the reasons I became a big, big reader of books at a young age was because I was hungry for truth, And back then, we didn't have the internet. We didn't have cell phones. You know, we lived in a pre-internet, pre-Wi-Fi, pre-home computer or personal laptop era. So if you wanted to look or research information, you had to walk to a local library or go to a library, a big library or whatever. You had to go to the library. And fortunately, the New York City libraries were very good. They stocked a lot of books on a lot of different topics, and they emphasized reading. One thing about an atheistic liberal culture, this used to be the case. I don't think it's the case any longer. I think people have been zombified by just going into a trance state, and they're glued to the internet or social media or television or whatever. So back then I would walk a couple of long blocks to the local public library, which was a good one. And, you know, I would check out probably on average, I would say 15 books a month. Now, I read books usually very quickly in a kind of speed reading. It depended what kind of book. When I was searching for answers, I taught myself how to do a form of speed reading. I didn't take a course or anything. And I would read very quickly, line by line, paragraph by paragraph, hunting for the vital sources of information in the books. And so the statement that, you know, I would rent on average 15 books a month, or more, by the way, it is not such a bizarre statement in light of the fact that I taught myself how to read in a form of speed reading. Now, when I read science fiction novels, and I did that also to search for truth, because inside the contents of science fiction novels, they basically downloaded into your brain all kinds of ideas and concepts about science and technology and physics and everything else. So I devoured science fiction novels as part of both entertainment, fun, and research. And I would go to the library, and I thought, because I was raised in an atheistic household, that science had the answers to my questions. So I read the biographies of every great scientist that I could get my hands on. So that was probably right there. That was probably about 70 books. They had at least 70, maybe 100 books that were the biographies of the great scientists. And I devoured those books because that was a kind of an interesting way to learn science. And then I would read books on science. And they had, I don't know, hundreds of books, if not 1,000 books easily, on all different disciplines in science, and that would include technological discoveries. So I devoured those books along with the biographies. Now, that included also the biographies of the great inventors like Nikola Tesla and Thomas Alva Edison, the inventor of the light bulb and the movie projector and the record player. This guy invented, like, you know, at least 25 major new technologies that transformed not only the United States but the world. And I read the bios of other inventors. And then scientists. I would read everything from the biography of Madame Curie, the biographies of Louis Pasteur, Enrico Fermi, and nuclear physics. I read the whole account of the Manhattan Project, the race to build the atomic bomb, headed up by the physicist Robert Oppenheimer, and I devoured this stuff. I didn't just stop there. I devoured the books on the psychiatrists and the psychologists. And this was at a I started this at a very, very young age. Let's say approximately second grade. And I chose a little softer books in second grade. But I was because of my household, because I lived in an atheistic but also intellectual and creative artistic household, middle class. But my parents' friends were a mixture of middle class and people who were very high up in their professions or became extremely high up in their professions. And I hated classical music. My mother still is an excellent pianist, and she was a trained pianist, and she was trained as an opera singer and other things. And so she would play the piano, classical music, for hours on end, like practically every day. Now, at the time and for decades afterwards, I hated classical music with a passion. It was like fingernails on a blackboard to me. And so it irritated me because from my youngest ages, I was into rock and roll, and I forgot what they called music before rock and roll, pop music or whatever. So that's the stuff I liked, rock and roll, pop music, things like that. And I certainly didn't like classical music. But my mother would invite her friends over to the house on a regular basis. I think they rotated houses. And it would be like 7 or 8 people, very prominent people in the sense of well-known artists and painters, musicians, sculptors, investments and stockbrokers, but they all had training and they all had a passion and love for classical music. So they would get together and in rock and roll terms, you say they got together and jammed. Well, they didn't jam, but they did. I don't even know what the classical term is when you get together and you play classical music and everybody plays different instruments. So the point of this is I didn't understand back then, and I didn't probably understand this until about 20 years ago. And what I learned is that scientifically, it's a matter of scientific fact, psychological fact, biological fact. It is now a proven fact that when you expose young children especially, or children especially, even to preteens and teens, and even young adults, and it even works with adults. The impact is not as profound with adults, but the principle still works, especially with children. When they hear classical music, which is very complex music, it creates new and brand new neurological pathways in the brains of children who listen to classical music, because there is both a mathematical complexity to classical music. And classical music, I don't know, most of you may have or may not have had, may have seen it on television. I don't know what your background is, but anyone who has gone to hear a professional symphony where there's a huge number of musicians on stage and there's a conductor. And growing up in New York City, you had the opportunity to go to places like Carnegie Hall, etc., and they would have the world's most acclaimed conductors and symphonies perform classical music. And you've seen the pictures. I can't even remember the names of all the different instruments, the stringed instruments, the horns, the piano, each instrument, each musician is highly trained just in, for example, playing the piano or the cello or a trumpet or on and on and on. And because of the complexity, because of the variations and the differences of all these instruments coming together in an orchestrated synergy that produces a very high level complex music, which by the way is not necessarily a turn on to many generations of people anymore. And most likely, if you've had children, and perhaps you yourself may not have liked, like me, I didn't like classical music. I liked rock and roll. So it's not a turn on to the modern mind, to the modern kid or whatever, because they're interested in rock and roll or hip hop or rap or pop music or country music or whatever. But those other musical forms do not vastly increase the neurological pathways. Classical music vastly increases the neurological pathways. And with the increase of neurological pathways and the building of brand new neurological pathways and the release of an entire spectrum of biochemicals, to put it bluntly, it's a scientific proven fact, and has been for quite a while now, that regular, consistent exposure of classical music to children and teenagers, etc., it makes them far smarter because it grows their brain in a very substantial way. The brain, especially when you're younger, has the capacity to be like a rocket and go into the sky and go into orbit. The brain has limitless possibilities if you provide an environment that will stimulate the brain to grow. And that also increases things like intelligence, it increases perception, it increases cognitive abilities, mathematical abilities, memory. I mean, I could probably go down a list with you and name easily 25 super powerful benefits that happen to the human brain, the human mind, especially when there has been regular exposure to classical music when people were young children. Now, the reason the exposure is so intense among young children has to do with a term that scientifically is called neuroplasticity, which could be said this way, neurological plasticity. What that simply means, neuroplasticity, is that when your brain starts to become hard or hardened, I'm talking about in a literal physical sense. Let's say they open up your skull, they examine your brain, or they do an MRI or whatever they do to take an internal picture of your brain, or they perform surgery and examine a brain. And they can look and measure the brain. And if a brain is healthy, and if a brain is healthy and a brain is smart, it's because the brain is still flexible. It's still moldable. It's not rigid. It's not like a rock. It's more like, this is kind of odd, but it's more like Jello or something. It's flexible. And when the brain is still flexible, it then still has the potential to change shape, which means it can still become more intelligent. The brain can still grow, and the brain is moldable, which means if it's not rigid, the brain is moldable, and you can sculpt it, etc. Those are all signs of a healthy brain. When people age and they start to get Alzheimer's and dementia and lose their memory, and they can't think very well, and they begin to lose their perception and their cognitive abilities, etc., it's because the brain, over time, or bad nutrition or abuse of whatever, the brain loses its neuroplasticity. So neuroplasticity is vital to a healthy, intelligent brain. Now, because of that, young children, because of their age, they have, just based on biology, they have incredible neuroplasticity in their brains. And that means they have an incredible capacity to grow their brains, shape their brains, which means they have, because of their neuroplasticity, an incredible potential to become super intelligent, to think outside of the box, to create, to innovate, to be an entrepreneur, to come up with ideas, to have incredible memory, analysis, etc., an incredible ability to learn multiple languages. The younger the child is, the easier it is for the child to learn multiple languages. So there are certain environments that a young child can be in where they have incredible neuroplasticity. And in those environments, a child can easily learn 3, 4, 7 different languages. And they can speak them fluently, and they can read and write in those languages. But when they become an adult, they don't have the same amount of neuroplasticity, and things like learning multiple languages is much more challenging. The same thing is true for just about any learning experience. Children learn faster and learn quicker, especially when it comes to learning new things. And that's not only learning in the brain cognitive sense. That's also body memory, body intelligence learning. So, for example, you could take any given sport, baseball, football, basketball, swimming, gymnastics, ice skating, ballet, you could go on and on and on. When a child is young and you train them athletically in any number of physical sports, they can easily and quickly learn and become excellent in a whole variety of sports because their bodies have memories and they are flexible. And that's why, when people train for the Olympics, etc., the younger, the better. The younger, the better. Has to do with neuroplasticity. Okay, so I didn't know this at the time, but by the grace of God, even though I was raised in an atheist household, because my environment, because my home that I grew up in, my parents emphasized reading. I was exposed to high-level discussions among adults that these were like PhD and above discussions. And I was sitting there, as a little kid. I'm not saying I understood everything that they were saying, but it builds and you start to understand. And I'm listening to discussions on existentialism and modern art and history and science and technology and very complex ideas and with expanded vocabulary. Well, even though I'm not like 100% paying attention to all this, I'm subconsciously absorbing this download of ideas and concepts and history and things like abstract ideas and conceptualization and imagination and creativity. So like nobody planned this out, but when you're immersed in that environment as a child, what that does is it supercharges the growth of your brain, and your brain begins to produce trillions of new neurological pathways, plus releasing an entire spectrum of brain-growing, intelligence-producing chemicals, biochemicals. And on top of that, my parents and their friends were intellectuals, writers, artists, painters. So I would go to somebody's house or whatever. And these were very non-traditional homes in every respect. I mean, one particular guy's home, they bought a carriage house that was built around the time of George Washington in Upper New York State. Now, you may know what a carriage house is. I didn't until somebody explained it to me. It was a huge house. I mean, the living room was like the size of a high school gymnasium or a high school basketball court. The ceilings were like enormously high. And that's because, and this carriage house, of course, they had to remodel it to make it fit with bedrooms and kitchens and all the rest of that stuff. And it came with a large piece of property. But this was a carriage house, and down the road was the actual house, because at one time, the actual house, which was a mansion, and then the carriage house and this enormous amount of property around it, all belonged to some very wealthy person. That it was built sometime after the Revolutionary War. And so the carriage house was, it contained the stables for the horses, so there was like a large stables that probably could have housed 12, 15 different horses. There were carriages, there were all kinds of unique rooms, and very spacious areas that because they were artists, they refurbished and then they made it into something very beautiful. Now, the house itself was out of the box. And the guy, the husband, these were friends of my parents. He was a painter, a respected painter, and his paintings were so large that when you walked in the house, his paintings were as high as, let's say, a large 2-story suburban house. So his paintings were approximately 2 stories high. That's huge. And the width of his paintings were approximately either 2 stories high or 1 story. These were giant paintings, and they were abstract, and they were incredible with their color, and these were pleasing abstract paintings. So you're being visual, your perception is being blown wide open as a young kid. Your visual perception is drinking in this high stimulus of creativity and out-of-the-box thinking. Then as a little kid, you're sitting around as your parents and their friends talk, and they're talking in equally high-level conversation that is also completely out of the box. And they're talking, this is not the conversation that I'd had different kinds of friends, and I would go to different kinds of homes and stuff. And most of them, the conversations were very mundane. They were very much in the box, and they had to do with very simple, routine things, because that reflected the consciousness of the people that lived there. And it wasn't very stimulating. And that was really the average household that I would visit. But when I would go to the homes of these artists and these out-of-the-box thinkers, it was like, as a tiny young boy, I was sitting in a PhD philosophy class, a PhD history class, a PhD art class. I would learn all about the Roman Empire versus the Greek Empire versus the Egyptian Empire. And this wasn't 5 minutes. This was an endless download of thousands of hours pouring into my brain. So you take the visual perception stimulation, you take the high-level intellectual content conversation, you take the being immersed in high-level classical music, and nobody planned it, but your brain, when it is exposed to this level of stimulus, it produces trillions of neurological pathways. Now, what that does is it acts as a basic primary programming software embedded into your human biocomputer as a young child, and it prepares you not only for childhood, it equips and forms your mind, because your mind is shapeable at that age, neuroplasticity, and it stays with you the rest of your life. And it gives you an advantage. Now, I'm not saying this to brag. I'm just saying this was my experience. Now, I just want to pause there for a moment. All that rich stimulus, intellectually, creativity, with music, with athletics, etc., with art, sculpture, painting, philosophy, economics, all of that stimulus is embedded and programmed into your brain. And that software is embedded in your brain, and it sets your brain up to begin to grow even faster and perceive and increase in his cognitive abilities even faster. It becomes a kind of launching pad for your brain and your consciousness at a young child. Okay. Now, on the opposite side, if you deprive, to the degree that you deprive a child of high-level stimulus, to the degree you deprive a child from high-level conversations, you deprive a child of reading books, you deprive a child of creativity, athletics, stimulus in all kinds of learning areas, to the degree that you deprive a child of all the stimulus and input at a young age, what happens, in a sense, is the reverse. Instead of an expansion of the mind and the brain, there is a shrinking of the brain, a shrinking of consciousness, and then that brain, that child's brain, which is born with so much God-given potential, it won't reach its potential because its programming caused it to only be able to think in a small, routine, tiny box. So, you have a choice, depending upon what pathway you take. And one pathway will take you to growing your brain and thinking out of the box. And the other pathway, when you're deprived of stimulus, will shrink your brain and cause you to only think in a small box, which is where most people think, in a small box. In America today, people, year after year, people are thinking in a smaller and a smaller and a smaller box. And it's intentional. It's intentional because there exists an elite who have an agenda, and that agenda is total control and power. And total control and power can only be maintained when you program people to think inside of a small box, when you shrink their brains, which is another way of saying total control and power over the masses happens when you dumb people down. So there has been a scientific dumbing down of the population in America and in just about every nation of the world. And why is that important to these people? Because people who are dumbed down are easy to control, easy to subjugate, easy to enslave, easy to dominate. Why? Because, conversely, as we say on the Paul McGUIRE report all the time, knowledge is power. Okay? Knowledge is that stimulus I've been talking about. Knowledge will produce power in a person's life. Knowledge, especially imparted to a young child or a young student, causes them to think outside of the box, which is another way of saying they become more intelligent. So the elite know all this. They don't educate their children the way the average middle class and working class person in America educates their children. the purpose of the educational system, in the words of the leaders and the thinkers who designed our educational system and modeled it after the communist education system in the former Soviet Union or Russia, beginning in 1917, John Dewey, one of the fathers of public education in America. What was John Dewey, one of the fathers of public education in America, doing hanging out in communist Russia and learning from the communist Russian propagandists? Why would an American educator want to learn the educational principles of communist Russia? Because the educational principles of communist Russia are all based on mind control, brainwashing, indoctrination, and programming. Because it's a dictatorship. They're not free. In America, we're supposed to be a free nation. So why is it that the man who basically designed public education in America used the communist Russian formula and was trained by the communist Russians? Now, I want to pause. When I throw out a question like that at a conference that I'm speaking at, or when I was speaking at a very reputable Christian college and seminary to hundreds of pastors, I was speaking. It was a whole series of presentations that were being given to pastors who flew in from all over the country. And I was sharing some of what I just shared to you. And when I got to the really deeper stuff, and I talked about John Dewey being in communist Russia and learning the communist Russian educational methodologies, which were basically built on brainwashing, mind control, and propaganda. And then I paused. There was that uncomfortable silence in the room among the pastors. Now, there's two ways to perceive and process why there was an uncomfortable silence among the pastors. Was it because they were embarrassed for me and what I said was awkward and they didn't know, what to say? You've been in rooms like that. You've been in environments like that where somebody gets up and says something, maybe even the speaker, and it's like awkward. It's like that hasn't been said here before. And so there's an uncomfortable tension and silence in the room as the listeners try to process or categorize what this person said. Because what this person has said is either because they're off balance, they don't know what they're talking about, and people are like embarrassed for them or whatever. That happens. Well, I'm not insecure. And the reason I'm not insecure is because I've done my homework. I've paid the price. I've studied. I've researched. I've read thousands of books. I've referenced and cross-referenced and checked and double-checked my material. So, to be blunt, I know what I'm talking about. I also have been around the block, both with pastors and other groups of people, and I have a pretty good sense of what they know and what they don't know. So, I'm not concerned about the awkward silence in the room. In fact, I deliberately don't say anything so that the awkward silence continues. You say, well, why would you do that, Paul? I'm doing that for a strategic reason. Because I recognize, I'm not processing or perceiving what's happening in the room or I'm lecturing through through the internal bias of personal insecurity. Okay, so I'm not doubting myself. I'm not nervous, and first and foremost, my goal is not to be liked. Oh, I would have liked to be liked. Don't get me wrong, but I'm not there to be liked, and I'm not there to be disliked. It would be good if I'm liked, but that's not my goal. My goal is to communicate the truth that will set people free. So I said what I said, which was similar to what I just shared with you. And there's this awkward silence. Now, what most people do when they're speaking is they interrupt the awkward silence that they may have created by something they said, and they want the group to move along real quick so they can forget about the awkward silence and get on to something else really quick. That's what most people do. That's what comedians do. When comedians crack jokes, sometimes they get some really funny jokes and everybody's laughing like crazy. And then they'll throw out a joke that just bombs. Well, the comedian doesn't sit there in silence and let the people meditate on the joke that just bombed. The comedian will immediately start to fire out other jokes to try to get laughs, and also to get the people to forget that the last joke was a bomb. But that was not my strategy. My strategy was to deliberately allow the awkward silence to kind of hover in the room. I mean, not forever, just for maybe an extra minute or two. An extra minute or two of total silence is very intensive to most Americans. Okay? They don't know what to do with it. But I'm deliberately allowing the awkward silence to continue for a couple of minutes. Because, and I don't mean this unkindly, I want them to stew in it. Which is another way of saying, I'm trying to lovingly but strategically confront them. Because you see, I know what's really going on in their mind. What's really going in on their mind is they've never heard this content before. And this content that I'm delivering is shaking up the small box that they're thinking in. It is potentially threatening if it's true. If what I'm really saying is true, and I'm not just some flake, wacko, and nut, then they know deep inside that they got to deal with it. And that makes them uncomfortable because it's much easier to stay in the confines of the small box of thinking. So I want them to think about it for a minute. And I want them to at least entertain for what a minute or two. I want them to entertain the idea of, could what this guy is saying be true? Because if it is true, if I'm going to be the Christian leader that I'm supposed to be, I need to know something about it. I shouldn't just be bearing it and moving along. So they don't know what to think. And in an environment like that, what inevitably happens is from the audience, a spokesman or a spokeswoman or a leader will emerge. And they uninvited will either stand up or speak up loudly, and they will either affirm what I've said, encourage me, say amen or something, add a comment to reinforce what I'm saying, or a leader or a spokesperson may emerge who will attempt to disparage me and attack me and say that I'm crazy, this is a conspiracy theory, or you're lying. And I see, I'm not controlling what's happening. I'm letting go of it. And there's a risk in that. And the risk is when you do that, a spokesperson may emerge who's going to attack you and try to tear apart what you've asserted, or a spokesperson may emerge that will support what you say. I'm prepared for either, and so I'm not worried about it. So in this particular case, it was less than 30 seconds. Now, I don't even think it was like 5 seconds or 10 seconds at most of silence after I had said something similar to what I just said to you. And one of the pastors becomes angry. Now, the reason I know he's become angry is because he didn't raise his hand to speak. He just shouts out to the room and shouts out to me something to the effect of, "You're lying. That is a conspiracy and that's a conspiracy theory, and that is not true." Now, his response was somewhat irrational because he didn't say why I was lying. He offered no historical proof to support what he said. He simply attacked me on an emotional level. And what happens then is people who may be leaning his way will join in with him, or people who don't know may out of insecurity, they're looking for which way the wind is blowing, so they may join in with him. Or there may be people who will rally to my defense and argue on my behalf by volleying back at him. So his goal is, the problem is, the real reason he's attacking me is not because he knows what he's talking about, because he doesn't. If he knew what he was talking about, he would offer actual facts and historical documentation to refute what I asserted. Okay? But he's not doing that. He's just saying, "You're lying, it's a conspiracy," and there's a lot of anger and viciousness in his voice. That's because what I said threatened him. And it was not my intention to threaten him. I was simply there to communicate the truth and facilitate, through my presentation, growth, both spiritually and growth through knowledge, because knowledge gives you power. And when you've got a bunch of pastors who are leaders and they're absolutely clueless about these matters, their leadership is rather ineffectual over the long term because they don't understand the reality that they live in. So I responded to him calmly and politely, and simply said, "You're incorrect." And then I cited like chapter and verse from reputable sources, quotes from books, and the actual spokespeople and the actual historical evidence to support what I asserted. Now, for all the pastors that were honest and open, they realized, well, okay, this guy knows what he's talking about. But to the person that was angry, he did not respond to any of the facts that I gave to document what I had just said. So now he realizes he's embarrassed because he doesn't have any facts, and when I respond to him with facts, and I'm not trying to win an argument, it's not my goal. I'm simply trying to communicate a truth, and I'm not going to surrender the truth to somebody who hasn't spent 3 minutes researching the subject. So when I respond to him, he cannot respond with any facts or historical information. So he grabs all his books and stuff and he storms out of the room. Well, okay, that happens. Again, my purpose is not to get an applause all the time. I mean, you can do that. You can manipulate an audience to get an applause. I'm there to teach. I'm there to impart what the Lord has shown me and integrate it with the Bible and the biblical worldview so that we can be effective in preaching the gospel. We can dismantle the works of the adversary. So, God in this case, it was evident to me that God supernaturally showed up to help me. I did not know it, because oddly, when I was still in the middle of making my presentation, they announced lunch. Now, you got a whole bunch of hungry pastors, many who have traveled across the country, and they want a fellowship. I understand that. But it's very hard for a speaker, no matter how good a speaker is, no matter how prepared a speaker is, it's hard to compete with lunch, especially if the lunch is good. And they want a fellowship with their friends. I got that. So, I'm about halfway in the middle of my presentation or less. And they announced lunch, which was a mistake on their part. So, I got hundreds of pastors leaving the room because, lunch is lunch. And if you don't make it on time to lunch, there will be no lunch. So I had to deal with what I thought was a sizable reduction in number of people in the large room I was speaking. But I've trained myself over the years that I will speak to a crowd that's tiny, medium size, or large. I will give whatever crowd the passion, the enthusiasm, hopefully share the anointing of the Holy Spirit. I will show up and give it my best, whether I'm speaking to 5 people or 5,000 people. I've trained myself to do that, and so I don't, only give my best to a large crowd. I'll give my best to just a small group of people too. And that frees you up because you can't control the numbers as you do conference speaking and speak at churches and stuff. Anyway, one of the guys who had taken a number of my classes, because I was a professor of eschatology or Bible prophecy by this particular seminary and Christian university, and had the personal endorsement of the founder, which was a blessing. But anyway, he came up after me during the presentation. And again, we had become friends because he had attended a number of my courses and classes. And he said, "Paul, you know what happened?" I said, "No." He said, "You probably wondered where all the people went when we announced lunch." He said, "But what you didn't know is all those hundreds of pastors who gathered into another very large room to have lunch, there were a whole bunch of giant big screen projection televisions in that room. So I think there was like 3 or 4 giant projection television screens, the huge ones. And he said, your entire presentation was played over these giant television screen projection units to the pastors while they were having lunch. And he said somebody forgot to turn the volume down. And I don't know what that, I mean, maybe it meant he turned the volume up. But he said somebody turned the volume down. Actually, somebody left the volume up. And he said, every one of those pastors, even those that were attending different sessions, when they were all gathered in the lunchroom, all of the pastors that had come for this giant pastors conference, all of the pastors heard your entire message because it was being projected on all these giant screen televisions with the volume turned up loudly. And so when they were talking, they had to try to talk over your message, which was very loud due to these projection television sets. So he said this, not me. He said, God bless you. And I realized God did bless me because I knew that the topic and the subject matter I was going to talk about was going to be some tough rowing. Because what I talk about, it's not the typical soft, squeaky clean evangelical message. I mean, that's not my job. My job is to speak the truth that sets people free. And it's not intended to be confrontational, but it ends up being confrontational because when people are stuck in the rut of thinking in a small box and they only want to believe that reality and what's happening in our nation is due to whatever they've been taught it is, they initially may react kind of aggressively towards the speaker when you break the ice of their paradigm. And I understand that because I used to be the same way. I mean, many decades ago, when I first heard somebody else or read somebody else saying some of the things that I regularly say today, because I know it's true now, when I first heard some of these concepts and ideas, I reacted like some of these pastors who are critical or people who get defensive and attack you. I mean, I would think, oh, that's a conspiracy theory, because that's what I was programmed to think. But you see, when I went back and did my homework for decades and actually looked up and double-checked and researched, I found out that it was true, and there were facts to support it. And that's what you need. You need, in order to be who God created you to be, if you're a parent, single mother, single father, grandparent, whatever, your responsibility is to cultivate an environment where your child's brain can grow. And if you don't think that's a godly biblical assignment, then you need to reread your Bible. Because there are very, very powerful interests, such as the globalist elite, who are intentionally dumbing your children down. And they're using some of the principles that I just talked to you about. So you need to cultivate an environment which will stimulate their brains, their minds, their perception. And you need to encourage them. And you got to make it fun and exciting because guess what? We all know we're in competition. One of the most powerful ways or methodologies that will grow your mind, grow your cognitive abilities, your perception, your thinking power. One of the most powerful ways there is to read books. Read books, because books contain the right books, by the way. The books that communicate answers and intelligence, and most of all, knowledge. Because when you read books, you're allowing an outflow of knowledge to pour into your inner man or woman, or to pour into the minds of your children or young adults. Look, knowledge is power. The globalist elite that rule this world. And if you think that statement in and of itself is a conspiracy theory, and that angers you, then you haven't done your homework. Because this is not only the consensus of opinion of very educated people on the left, as well as very educated people in the conservative realm, and those that are very educated in the Christian realm, who have done their homework. They know for a fact, because indeed it is a fact, and it's documented by first-hand credible sources. If you read the right books, like my books, I document. I don't quote, some guy that was taken up by a UFO in Area 51. That's not a credible source. The reality that our world is controlled by approximately 12 or maybe 13 super wealthy international banking families, also known as the globalist elite. Our entire world is ruled by about just 12 men, or maybe 12 families. And they control all the major power centers of nations and society. They control economics, they control money, they control technology, science, medicine, government, law, biology, technology, computers, artificial intelligence. They control the constitutions, the governing documents of nations. They control whether or not we go to war or whether we have peace, because they, and I'm not making this up, I documented it. I give you the names and everything. For example, in my book, The Day the Dollar Died, which is a fast and fun read, by the way, I name these international banking families. And I name the names of the international banking families who, by the way, it's a matter of historical fact and record that some of these heads of these international banking families have notoriously financed both sides in World War I, and they financed both sides in World War II. I name their names. And so here you have, and I talk about it in The Day the Dollar Died. You can get it at paulmcguire.us. Here I name one of the primary 12 international banking families. And one family is headed up by two brothers. One brother is headquartered in the United States of America, and this is the brother that loans the money for interest. This is the brother that finances the United States of America when it's fighting against Germany in Europe. So one brother is financing the weapons, the airplanes, the bombs, the tanks, the militaries for the United States of America. but the other brother is in charge of the money and the military in Germany. And he's financing the German armies, the German planes, the German bombs, the German soldiers and bullets, etc. I mean, this is like evil personified. Americans who died serving their country, who went overseas to Europe to fight against the Germans. Thousands and thousands of Americans died, had their legs blown off, lost their minds with PSTD, never came back to their wives and children. Countless thousands of Americans were slaughtered fighting the Germans. And to think that this war was largely financed by two brothers, but one of the brothers was financing the Germans, financing the bullets, the bombs, the planes, and the military of Germany. And it was this German military that were slaughtering, killing, and blowing off the legs of the American soldiers. And purely for the sake of making money, these brothers of one of these 12 international banking families, one brother is financing Germany and the other brother is financing America. And what an obscenity that American soldiers gave their lives and were maimed and blown to bits and killed by bullets that were financed by this international banking family that was playing games, and they were making money on both sides of the war. And that's not the first time it's happened. It's happened in other wars. Now think about that. Think about how soulless you have to be. And you see, Christians don't want to know the truth about these things largely because they're playing a little game. You see, as long as they dismiss the statements of truth, like the one I just made about the two brothers financing different sides of the war, as long as Christians call statements like mine, which are based on fact, and I've documented it in my book, The Day the Dollar Died, as long as Christians try to dismiss that truth by calling people like me a conspiracy theorist and accuse me of making it up, the reason they're playing that little mind game is because it frees them up from having to make changes, from having to be responsible, from having to actually do something to change and rectify the situation. And there's a whole lot more to that story. A whole lot more. The world is not the way you have been told it is. You have been told from the youngest of ages, you have been told essentially a fairy tale. You have been told a nursery rhyme, like a Mother Goose story or a Humpty Dumpty story. You haven't been told real history. You haven't been told real economics. You haven't been told the truth. You've been told fairy tales. And then, because you don't have knowledge, you have no power, and this gives the globalist elite, many of which who are Luciferian. And you say, well, how can you say that? Because I've done my homework. That's why I can say that. I've done my homework. And those that would disagree with me or would attempt to criticize me for making such an assertion, quite frankly, they haven't done their homework. Therefore, they don't really have the right to speak. I mean, they have the right to speak in the sense that everybody should have the right to speak. But they have not earned the right to speak in the sense that they're not credible because they haven't done their homework. They have no knowledge, therefore they have no power, and they're being exploited and used. You need to go to paulmcguire.us, that's paulmcguire.us, and get yourself a bunch of my books that you can get at a financial discount right now, a book bundle discount. You need to pre-order my brand new book, Power from On High. And when you pre-order it, you're buying it before the release of the book. You're buying it before it's finished. I'm finishing it up now. But you will get it at a financial discount, and you will get your copy mailed to you by priority mail. You'll get your copy before it's released to the general public. And Power from On High will rock your world. I promise you. And the book that I wrote before that is The Greatest Battle for the Hearts and Minds of Mankind in the History of the World. That's an easy read also, but it basically tells you exactly what's going on and where we're going. So visit paulmcguire.us, that's paulmcguire.us. Remember, we are fighting the greatest battle for the hearts and minds of mankind in the history of the world. We are in the last days. At some point in time, only God the Father knows, Christ is going to return. And what we're really fighting, and I explain this in Power from On High and my other books, is that the Luciferian system behind the globalist elite, that Luciferian system is talked about in the Bible in incredible detail. It is known as, and is written in the book of Revelation quite extensively, it is known as Mystery Babylon, the mother of harlots. And when you read the book of Revelation and you read about Mystery Babylon, you see how the great and mighty men of the earth, that's the elite, and the merchants that are super wealthy, that's the elite. These super merchants, the super wealthy, the kings and queens of the earth, the movers and shakers, the people with the power and the money, the people that own the television networks, the computer networks, who own nations and who are master planning a new world order, which they've rebranded and they now call the Global Reset. They are working upon the template, the plan that is known as Mystery Babylon. And in the book of Revelation, it talks about how the kings of the earth and the mighty men and the super rich fornicated with the great harlot, Mystery Babylon. What do you think that means? And by the way, I explain to you in detail what it means in the books. But what do you think it means? That the kings of the earth, the mighty men, the kings and queens, that they fornicated with the great harlot, Mystery Babylon. What do you think that means? It means that they became one with her, that they entered into an immoral and illicit relationship with her, that in fact they sold their souls to Mystery Babylon. Because when you sell your soul to Mystery Babylon to get power, sex, money, fame, or whatever, you're really selling your soul to Satan. Satan will make a deal for you. But remember, Satan is the father of lies. And when you make a deal with Satan, you're going down, baby, and you are not going to enter the kingdom of heaven. Read the book of Revelation. Because you see, if you're following and fornicating with Mystery Babylon in this world system, your name will not be written in the book of life. And in order to get into heaven, you have to have your name written in the book of life. So how do you get your name written in the book of life? Not 87% of evangelical churches absolutely refuse to teach the book of Revelation or the Bible when it comes to Bible prophecy. You know what that means in its most simplistic terms? It means that approximately 90% of evangelical pastors, evangelical seminaries, evangelical churches, evangelical Bible studies, approximately 90% of them are in flat-out open rebellion from God, and they have ignored God's warnings regarding the book of Revelation, and they have chosen to not teach the book of Revelation or to change the book of Revelation, which is a direct violation of God's commandments regarding His Word and God's commandments regarding teaching and reading the book of Revelation. They just, they spout off these trivial pursuit cliches. What would Jesus do? Well, you know what I think Jesus would do? Being that Jesus is the Word become flesh, which simply means Jesus is the Word of God. Don't you think Jesus, being the actual Word of God, being the Word becoming flesh, don't you think Jesus, when we say what would Jesus do, don't you think Jesus would honor His own Word and teach faithfully and truthfully the entire book of Revelation and the entire Bible? I mean, you don't even have to answer the question. You already know the answer. Of course, He would teach the entire book of Revelation truthfully. Why? Because that's the rules regarding the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation is the only book in the Bible where God gives a warning and rules at the very beginning of the book of Revelation, as well as a warning and rules at the very end of the book of Revelation. In addition, the book of Revelation is the only book of the Bible where God offers a blessing to anyone who reads it or teaches it faithfully. And conversely, the book of Revelation is the only book in the Bible where God warns of a curse, a heavy curse, if you teach the book of Revelation unfaithfully or you refuse to teach it. That makes the book of Revelation the most unique book in the Bible. There's no way to argue around it. In the book of Revelation, and I'm holding my Bible in my hand right here in the studio, and this is what it says. It begins about talking about the fact that the book of Revelation is the revelation of Jesus Christ. And then it says in verse 3, "Blessed is he who reads and those who hear the words of this prophecy and keep those things which are written in it, for the time is near." So the first promise here is that this is the only book in the Bible where God promises to pour out a blessing on those who read the book of Revelation and hear the words of the book of Revelation and obey and do the things in the book of Revelation that are written in it. It's the only book in the Bible that starts like this. Now, so this makes the book of Revelation different than every book of the Bible. Then at the end of the book of Revelation, we read other things which additionally make the book of Revelation totally unique among all the books of the Bible. And let me read to you what God says in the book of Revelation. And this is heavy stuff, man. This is sober stuff. You don't play with it. Okay. in Revelation chapter 22, starting at verse 9. This is the Apostle John speaking in the book of Revelation. For I am your fellow... Oh, no, let's start here. Worship God. This is an angel speaking. Worship God. And he said to me, do not seal the words of the prophecy of this book. What book? The book of Revelation. Do not seal up its words. Don't censor it from being taught. That's what it means. Do not seal the words of the prophecy of this book, for the time is at hand. And then it says in verse 12, and these are the words of Jesus, and behold, I am coming quickly, and my reward is with me, to give to everyone according to his work. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, the first and the last. Blessed are those who do his commandments, that they may have the right to the tree of life and may enter through the gates of the city. And then as we continue down to verse 18, listen to what is written in the book of Revelation. For I testify to everyone who hears the words of the prophecy of this book. What book? The book of Revelation. If anyone adds to these things in the book of Revelation, God will add to him the plagues that are written in this book. And if anyone takes away from the words of the book of this prophecy, God shall take away his part from the book of life, from the holy city, and from the things which are written in this book. Okay, so what this means is, regarding the book of Revelation, this is at the end of the book of Revelation, there is a warning that, for I testify to everyone who hears the words of the prophecy of this book, the book of Revelation. Now here's the warning. If anyone adds to these things, or if anyone adds to the book of Revelation stuff that isn't in there, God will add to him the plagues that are written in this book. And if anyone takes away from the words of the book of this prophecy, which means if anyone changes or removes any of the words of the book of Revelation, God will take away from his part from the book of life, from the holy city, and from the things which are written in the book. Well, what does that mean? If you take away from the book of Revelation, okay, God will take away your part from the book of life, from the holy city, and from the things which are written in this book. What does that mean? You cannot enter the kingdom of heaven unless your name is written in the book of life. But God says, regarding the book of Revelation, if you take away from anything, if you censor it or you remove it or you change it, the book of Revelation, God will take away your part in the book of life. That means your name will be removed from the book of life. So how are you going to get into heaven? In addition to that, God will take away your part from the book of life, but also from the holy city, that's the New Jerusalem, and from the things which are written in this book. There's a whole description in the book of Revelation of the beauty and the majesty and the wonder of heaven and the New Jerusalem, the new heaven, the new earth. And you will have a brand new glorified body. But you will lose all that if you take away from the book of Revelation. Now, these are the most glorious promises, and yet at the same time, the most dire warnings in the entire book of the Bible. And yet, despite these warnings, at the beginning and at the end of the book of Revelation, 87% of evangelical pastors, churches, seminaries, universities, denominations and Bible studies absolutely refuse to teach the book of Revelation, censor the book of Revelation, and in short, they are taking away from the book of Revelation, which guarantees that they will be cursed. I mean, what happened to the fear of the Lord? See, we have a job to do. We need to spread this message far and wide as fast as we can. And I need you to join with me and partner with me in doing that. I need you to be an intercessory prayer warrior and pray for me, my family, and this ministry. I need you to spread this message far and wide. Souls are at stake. And finally, I need you to pray to the Lord, and pray to the Lord in light of what I just shared with you from the book of Revelation. And then ask God, Lord, what would you have me do to help Paul McGUIRE Ministries in Paradise Mountain Church? And then whatever the Lord tells you to give in terms of donations and contributions, obey the Lord. Obey the Lord. You can do that by going to paulmcguire.us. That's paulmcguire.us. God bless you. This is Paul McGUIRE. Let's act on the book of Revelation.